Bronx Community College, Lehigh University, Lock Haven University, Montclair High School. Following the discussion, we will begin in alphabetical order with Bronx Community College. Then we will go to Lehigh University, then Lock Haven University, followed by Montclair High School, and then at the end, the Metro campus of Fairleigh Dickinson University. All right, well, I would just like to say that our topic this morning is NGO relations with the United Nations, and it is of critical importance because NGOs are very important partners for the member states of the United Nations in addressing the world's most significant problems. So we're very fortunate to have Reverend Bautista here, who is the president of the Conference of NGOs and an expert on NGO matters. Ambassador Kamal, I turn it over to you.
It's a pleasure to have as our distinguished panelist the president of CoNGO, Mr. Bautista, who is the president for the past 2 years of the Conference of NGOs, and for 30 years before that is an internationally recognized human rights activist from the Philippines. So this is a person of international standing in the past and even greater international standing at present. Welcome to this video conference, sir. Let me lay down the parameters of this argument of today. The United Nations has many problems, among them technical problems of loopbacks. But one of the most serious problems that we have is the contradiction between the first 3 words of the Charter and the rest of the Charter. The first 3 words of the Charter are "we the peoples." In other words, this is supposed to be an organization of the peoples of the world. But all the rest of the Charter of the United Nations defines peoples as members and defines members as states or governments. In other words, the confusion is that this is supposed to be an organization of peoples, but the only members in this organization are governments. Now, the problem in the world is that most governments, in fact almost all governments, are non-representative of peoples. In the best of democracies, the government represents 50 or 51% of the population. In the worst of countries, that is dictatorships, the percentage is even less. And so governments are not truly representative of peoples anywhere in the world. And so the question then is, how should the UN come to terms with this contradiction between definition and implementation? Now please note point number 2, that the United Nations, despite calling itself an organization, is not really an organization. It's basically a forum, it's a table. It's a large table with 192 chairs around it. And so all the successes and all the failures of the UN are not the failures or successes of the table, but of the people sitting around the table. They are the people who take the decisions and who give us either success or failure. And the problem therefore is, who are these people sitting around the table and taking the decisions? And as I said in point number 1, these people are all governments. In order to be on one of the chairs, you have to have this type of pass. You have to have a pass which defines you as a government representative. And that, unfortunately, rules out, as I said, the vast majority of the peoples of the world. And so decisions are being taken by non-representative members sitting around the United Nations table. And so now that gives us point number 3, that the entire problem is one of power sharing. We have a decision-making system which is being governed by governments, and which is not being governed at all by peoples. And so the question is, can we get the governments who are sitting around the table to share power of decision making with peoples? That is the real problem in the UN. And the answer is that governments don't like to share power. They just don't. In fact, nobody who has power ever wants to share power with others. And so we now have a major problem. We recognize the importance of peoples because they are the conscience of the world. They are the holders of the opinion of the world. And we have a bunch of decision makers who are non-representative and who don't want to give up or share power. And so we have a problem. And the question is, how are we going to solve the problem? And over the past 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years, are we moving towards a solution of the problem, or are we moving towards an intensification of the problem? My own feeling is that we are making life more difficult for non-governmental organizations and for civil society, rather than facilitating their entry into the decision-making process. And remember, it's not a question of allowing them to move around the UN itself. That is what is called access. It is much deeper than access. What we want is participation, not just access, but participation in the decision-making system, so that the conscience of the world, represented here by Mr. Bautista, can be enabled to participate in the decision-making of a bunch of people, probably represented by me, who are non-representative of the world. And so my question to you, sir, is, you have a very important position because you are the president of the Conference of NGOs. And therefore you sit at the apex of this problem. Are you succeeding or are you failing in improving the access and participation of the civil society and the NGOs into the decision-making system of the United Nations? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kamal. The response to your question is yes and no. And there are many approaches to responding to the very dilemma that I think you rightly and appropriately put it. True to form, Ambassador Kamal is civil society's foremost advocate. All his diplomatic years has been well known to be years where civil society and its organized form, the non-governmental organizations, have found a way to access the United Nations, but in those same years, that same access has been challenged, in many instances denied. The access to the United Nations and the presencing of NGO voice is threatened by many instances where both the physical presence as well as the political representation is not visible, neither is it made available in United Nations premises as well as United Nations conferences. Yes, it is imperiled, but it is also not, because I take the view that there are many ways of locating political will, and for me, political will is found in the greater polis, in the peoples, and I think Ambassador Kamal put it rightly, that the United Nations should be about peoples of the world, and yet this prime international organization has configured itself from the start as an organization of nation states, of member states. And it was only until 1996 when the